Good afternoon and welcome to our Queensland. Good afternoon and welcome to our Queensland candidate webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the state of the employment market in Queensland. We're going to be joined by a few of my colleagues. We're going to have Georgia talking about the application process and some tips on that. We're going to have Christina joining us to talk about interview prep. And lastly, we're going to have my colleague Leanne, who's going to talk about the resignation process and how to handle a count offer, which is particularly prevalent at the moment. So jumping into stats, first of all, what's happening in Queensland, and we do have a quick look as well at the Australian employment market. So we've got some stats to go through to kick us off. So first of all, if we jump in, this is, and it's actually updated as of yesterday. So it's a slide that comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it talks about the number of job vacancies, which is done by a quarterly report, which is a survey. If you can see on the left-hand side, so job vacancies for Australia, pretty clear that you can see a very, very big tick up there in the number of vacancies increasing, and it has actually dipped ever so slightly as of the last report compared to the previous quarter. However, there's a bit of a story behind that. So on the commercial side, it's dipped just at 3.2%. In the public sector, it has actually increased 10.5%, but there are a lot more roles on the commercial side. So overall, we've got a very, very small increase. But clearly, if you look at the trend there for job vacancies across Australia, it's definitely a market for candidates because there are a lot of jobs that are out there. If you have a look on the right-hand side, we've got the stats, and hopefully that's big enough for everyone to see. But if you take out Northern Territory, and this is a comparison of the number of jobs by state and the increase pre-COVID, that Queensland is actually leading the pack on that. So the biggest increase, and I believe it's over 100% increase in jobs by state. So, and that's something we're definitely seeing in Queensland, that is consistently a very busy market for us at the moment. Jumping into the next slide. So why have we got all these vacancies? So this is the results of the survey that the Australian Bureau of Statistics put out. It won't add up, just to let you know, we're not going to add up to 100% because you can select multiple reasons, but by far and large, what you can see at the bottom there is replacement and resignation. So the turnover rate has increased, and the next slide actually talks about that. But before we go into it, just looking at those reasons, so people leaving roles. Second to that, increased workload, and it can sort of snowball as well because it is very much related to recruitment. So there's organisations at the moment, and if you're working in a team at the moment, you may well have seen that if you're in a team of 5, maybe one person leaves, 2 people leaves, all of a sudden your workload goes up. And it's particularly topical at the moment because it can be a real challenge. It's definitely a hard time for employers to find staff. So if you're working in that team, you've had a few people leave, then what happens? Your workload goes up. And that can be handled for a period of time, but we are seeing that there's some employers that are just not able to meet the market. Maybe it's in terms of salary, maybe their employer value proposition is not that fantastic, that you have teams that are consistently having to do extra work to make up the fact that they're not able to replace roles. And that is snowballing to the point where you then lose those people as well. So it can be quite or very difficult, we'd say, for employers when people leave and the increased workload comes through. But there are other reasons for that increased workload, because the number of businesses that are growing. Particularly coming out of COVID, there's some that have absolutely roared and doing exceptionally well, and they just need to have more staff. Also, the expansion of business, which is part of that. Restructures, we are seeing some, mainly it's on a positive. So if you looked at redundancies and that sort of thing, we're really not seeing a great deal of that at all. It's more so that companies have been acquired and there's been a bit of a restructure, and then they're having to create new roles. So for the most part, it's positive. On the next slide. So job mobility, essentially, this is the turnover rate. So when you hear people talk about the Great Resignation, came out of the US, I'm sure everyone's probably familiar with that term. I don't think it really happened, certainly not to the extent as in America and Australia. So it did increase. So if you have a look there, you can see that it from 2020, 2021, it's definitely, again, we've got this pickup. So people are definitely looking for a role more than they have done so perhaps the last 8 or so years. But it's interesting when you look at the chart over time, particularly going back to a time that I wouldn't be working in the market, but late 80s, 90s, that it was a lot higher back then. And now it has, although come down, there has been a bit of an upward tick, which we've seen. And the reason is, I think, as candidates obviously more confident about the state of the market, and particularly a lot of people putting their hand up and seeing if they can better their salary or conditions. And at the moment, you definitely can. So the next slide. Population growth. So it's always that one that I'm particularly interested in. Because if you look on the left-hand side, you can see that we have overseas migration and interstate migration. So on the overseas front, so people obviously moving to Australia as migrants, you can see for New South Wales, that's by far where people are going. That's probably 4 times more likely, I think, than anywhere else. So you move to New South Wales. And then when it comes to interstate, so if you've moved to Australia or you've already been living here, and where do people move interstate? Well, by a very long shot, it's Queensland. So people moving to Queensland, they're leaving New South Wales, as you can see the minus, but it's up to 5 times more than anywhere else in Australia. So we are seeing a lot of people move to Queensland. How does that impact the job market? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't mean for employers that there is this huge wave of candidates and it's fantastic and there's loads of people to hire. It hasn't really come through that way at all. It's still a very tight market. There are more people moving up, but what we're seeing is there's a significant proportion of people that are simply keeping their jobs that they would have in Sydney or they have in Melbourne, gone through COVID, and particularly that bringing forward a lot of work from home. They've proved to their employer that they can work from home or they can work from anywhere. And then we're seeing people relocate to the likes of the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, and obviously going for a lifestyle change. And that's happened in a very big way. If you were to look at our property market, you see that's had a huge impact. That said, if you move from Sydney, as a lot of people are, you'll still find that I think the property market you probably think is pretty good compared to what it is in New South Wales. On the right-hand side is the annual population growth rate. And I think this is really interesting because when we talk about the number of vacancies that we have and it being very much on the upward side, is that there are a number of vacancies that are there for months and months and months. And the reason is yes, they might not be meeting the market, but also it is very hard to find simply people. We have had that dip. If you look at annual population growth rate, it goes down massively during COVID. So the number of immigrants has gone down. So immigration is a big part of it. Obviously, people have left as well. It is starting to tick up, and I know there's a lot of announcement coming out around visas. That said, we definitely have a shortage of people, and it's the tightest labour market I've ever seen, without a shadow of a doubt. And then lastly, a stat that shows this, when you look at the unemployment rate, it's pretty clear that we're in a pretty positive market at the moment. So to summarise, as a candidate, it's a good market to be in, I would say, because in broad terms across all sectors, there are a lot more roles than there has been in a long time. From an employer's perspective, it's a challenging market because it's very competitive. And what we're seeing is that from an employer's perspective, The biggest thing I'd say is a pay disparity that's happening. So if you've been in your role and you're listening today, maybe you've been in your role for 5, 10 years. I know there's some people longer. Unfortunately, and you may well be seeing this, is there is definitely pay disparity within teams where people are doing the same role. Because if you've recently joined an organisation, it's highly likely you've joined at the new market rate, which is significantly higher than what it was. If you've been with the organisation for a number of years, you've had your couple of % increases year on year. Not all organisations have then gone, we need to meet the market, move everybody up. So what you're seeing is the people that have recently joined are paid significantly more than those that haven't. And that has definitely created some rifts. And what we see is people are now asking for pay rises, not waiting for annual reviews. And I think, as you should do, there is a right way to do that and there's a wrong way. I would say my advice around talking about pay rises is just make sure you do your research. The worst thing I think you can do is get too emotional or sort of demanding about it. If you are considering looking for a role, I wouldn't necessarily always say, go and get the job and then come back and say, right, I want you to pay me more money. Have a discussion with your employer and have that if it is about pay, and you might have many other drivers, but if it is about pay, there's nothing wrong with having that discussion now, rather than waiting, and Leanne will get into this later around the counter offer, rather than waiting till you've got another job when you may well just stay anyway if they'd increase the rate. So definitely have a think about that. One of the big things as well for job seekers, I would say to look at is flexibility. So if you currently have the ability, say, to work from home a certain number of days, or you're doing pick-up drop-offs with the children, whatever it might be, when you're going for a new role, just make sure that you're very clear about what flexibility means, because we hear it again and again when we're taking a job brief. And had it last week, someone said, oh no, we're very flexible. Okay, great. This particular candidate has told us they work from home every Friday. Is that a problem? Yes, it is a problem. You can't really do it every Friday, and it's kind of maybe if they're sick. So, okay, so can they work from? No, they can't. So when you actually raise things around what does flexibility look like, it's interesting that you may find that you're completely on a different page, and there's nothing worse, obviously, in taking on a new role and finding out that you don't have the flexibility that you thought you did. So definitely raise it and have a real discussion about it. And I think it will make for a much better outcome overall. And that's it on the employment market in Queensland in terms of stats and figures. People might be wondering around the particular industries that are hiring at the moment. We're seeing the biggest increase after COVID is around the hospitality and accommodation sectors, because it obviously went down so particularly low, and it is a real challenge for them with a lack of migrants that have come through that we typically would have seen. People to people is predominantly a white collar recruiter, so where we see that most roles is in an office, and I would say across almost every sector, it is definitely very buoyant market. So there's no one particular industry I think that's standing out, aside from perhaps we're seeing quite a bit in mining, in healthcare, but overall a lot of businesses are hiring. So it's pretty much across the board. We have Georgia now to have a chat to you about the application process, to give you some tips. Over to you, Georgia.
Hi, I'm Georgia, and as Ben said, I'm here to talk about the application process. I've broken it into 3 different topics, so suitability, doing your research, down to the basics such as your cover letter and your resume. So I think the first thing when you're looking for a role, you're going through Seek, seeing what roles you want to apply to. You want to determine whether or not that position is going to be suitable for you. The first thing is, I think, thinking of your long-term career goals. So if you do have a long-term goal, is the job that you're applying to going to help you reach that said goal? For example, if you're looking to, say, become a HR manager, maybe your best starting point wouldn't be agency recruitment, if that makes sense. Down to the selection criteria as well. So when you're reading an advertisement on Seek, have a look at the selection criteria. If you're umming and ahhing about whether or not you think you'd be suited to this role, you probably won't be. look for a role that complements your strengths and a position that you can add value to. For example, a lot of roles will require licenses or certificates. We'll use a forklift license as an example. If that's essential for the position, it's usually put in the advertisement for a reason. So if you're not too sure, definitely reach out to the contact on the advertisement and see if maybe the employer is willing to upskill the person. But yeah, just making sure that you're definitely suitable for that position to begin with. Check if the location is right. So I guess the first thing is check the location on the advertisement. We'll use an example of if you're based on the Sunshine Coast and applying for a role on the Gold Coast, that's completely fine, but maybe include in your resume that you're relocating or just checking that you've got the location right to begin with. Also travel time. So it's easy to say that you're happy to travel up to an hour to and from work each day, but you've got to think if that's maintainable long term and something that you can commit to. Another thing that I think we've noticed a lot of in the current market is work from home opportunities. So I think now's the time to consider whether or not you are looking for work from home opportunities. If it's not advertised, reach out to the recruiter or the hiring manager and check that as well before putting through your application. Now, if you're applying for a role through an agency, this might not be as relevant, but doing your research. So is the organisation a place that you want to represent? Check the company website, check news articles, follow their employees on LinkedIn. Just check what they're up to and see if that's something that you're passionate about and a place that you're wanting to represent long term. Another example that I would use is like if you're passionate about, say, conservation or no animal testing, check if a company is doing that before putting through your application. There's nothing worse than getting sort of through to the offer stage and then finding out that maybe their professional values don't align with what you're looking for personally. Now, down to your resume and cover letter. So these are more of the basic aspects, and it might be a bit controversial, but I think unless the advertisement specifically asks for a cover letter, you can probably remove that. I personally think that cover letters can often distract recruiters and hiring managers from what's important. A lot of the time, what you're trying to relay in your cover letter can be added to the personal summary at the beginning of your resume, and we can find out a lot from your past experience and past achievements, which should be included on there as well. So the contents of your resume, you'd be surprised about sort of how a lot of people actually forget to put their name, their phone number, their email. That's something that you want to make sure that's on the first page. If you're not getting calls for jobs that you're applying for, just double check that you've actually got that information there to begin with. Basic thing as well, when listing your past roles, it's definitely best to put it in order from most recent to your not so recent jobs, just to make sure that we're looking at relevant information to begin with, and you're getting your point across, making it short and sweet. When listing roles on your resumes, it's definitely important to have your job title, the business that you're working for, your dates of employment, and whether or not it was a temporary role if it's short term. Gaps on your resume. Gaps are completely fine. We understand that life happens, but just be prepared to explain those gaps. It's always a good idea to include what your gaps are on your resume. So if you're on maternity leave, you're traveling, that's completely fine. But definitely, yeah, be prepared to explain those gaps if there are any. Another thing that I believe is really important is ensuring your resume is actually in a compatible format. So PDF is usually the best way to go. A lot of the time we'll get applications through and they're just not readable. So save yourself some time as well. Make sure it's in a PDF format and make sure everyone's able to open it and read it. You're definitely more likely to get some calls from recruiters and hiring managers if they're able to view your resume. Now, the introduction. So a lot of advertisements, you'll obviously see people's names and phone numbers at the bottom. It's completely fine to reach out to those people and introduce yourself, but be honest about the reason that you're calling. If you're calling to introduce yourself, you're interested in the job, explain maybe a bit about why you think you'd be a good long-term fit. You just want to make sure you're not asking questions that are already listed in the advertisement. Just be honest to begin with, always open and happy to have a chat with people. And it's good to get that personal connection to begin with. So I think that's pretty much it, really. Obviously, there'll probably be a couple of other things that I'm missing out, but suitability for the role, research, making sure your resume is readable, has all the information, is short and sweet, and you're sort of limiting the time that it takes in the process. And that's everything from me. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. And over to you, Christina.
Hi everybody, I'm Christina and I'll be talking about preparing for an interview. So I've sort of broken it down into before your interview, during the interview and after your interview. So my first step would be do your research. So obviously you want to research the company, familiarize yourself with the size, where they operate as well. So whether they're global, national, statewide, look at the website as well. Look at the company values, and if there's an about us section, it's always good to have a look through there as well. Also get to know who you are meeting and their roles. So usually with an interview they'd send out a confirmation, so you can look up their details on LinkedIn, just so you know the names and what they do in the company. Confirm the location for the interview. So if it's in the office, research travel arrangements in case you need to allow for extra time and parking. And if the interview is via Teams or Zoom, so a virtual interview, just make sure that you have a space that you feel comfortable doing the interview with no interruptions, a background that can be clear from distractions, and that you have a device that's reliable with a working microphone and camera. And then also obviously finding out what you need to wear for the interview. So if it's more of a corporate environment, make sure that you've got a shirt with some work pants. Or if you're going to an environment where you need to wear high vis or something, I wouldn't recommend wearing heels to your interviews. So just make sure that you know what you're going to wear and that it's suitable for the industry. Um, so my next step would be practice. So you can practice with a friend. So look up some common interview questions. There are lots of resources out there that have just some basic questions. For example, tell me about yourself or describe your strengths, and just have some pre-prepared interview answers in your back pocket that you can whip out, and then be able to apply those answers to examples from your resume. And then it's also a good idea to have a look at some common competency based interview questions. So these questions will sort of, they'll try and ask you to think on the spot and problem solve. So an example is like how you'd handle a conflict in the workplace. So practice some of those as well, just so you sort of get into the habit of being able to think on your feet. And you can draw on examples from your CV, using projects, or any examples that you can think of. My next tip would be get to know your CV and yourself. And this might sound quite self explanatory, but it is really important that you do know your CV and you know it inside out, because when you ask questions, they're going to have your CV in front of them, and you want to be able to make sure that you can explain what you've done and that what you say reflects on your resume as well. And also know your strengths. So have a list of your strengths, a mental list that you can be very confident when answering that question, and how those strengths will be able to be an asset to the team and would be suitable for what they're looking for. Um, Also, understand your weaknesses as well. Nobody's perfect, but also show how you've overcome them in the past, or how you can or have improved. But this is a really important question to be able to answer. They want to know that you can be vulnerable, but also yourself, and what you need to do to improve. Like everybody can improve in all areas. Also, be clear on your motivations for applying for the role. They want to know that you know the position and you would like to be there. So, what makes the role attractive to you and why you want to work there. And also be clear on why they should pick you for the role and what you can bring to the team. So my other tip would be revise the details before you go to the interview. So have a look through the PD, make sure you understand it, research anything that you're unsure about, understand what the expectations are and what the role entails. Also come prepared with some questions to ask at the end, just to, it shows that you're interested and you have done your research. So you can ask about the company culture or what their favourite thing is about working there. Always good to have some questions to ask at the end. So the next part will be going into during the interview. So you've done your research, you feel like you're familiar with the role. So I'd recommend arriving about 15 minutes early to your interview. Just to allow yourself a bit of time to breathe, find the office or parking or whatever. And then also, if you are doing it via Teams, I'd recommend logging in 5 to 10 minutes prior just to make sure your computer's working, that there's no updates or anything that happen that can be a bit stressful before an interview. Make sure that you slow down. Sometimes when we're nervous, we can speak quite quickly. So it is likely that you are speaking faster than you think you are. So just make sure you slow down and take deep breaths, and you feel like you don't need to rush to give an answer as well. You're allowed to pause and think about what you'd like to say. Um, Maintain eye contact and open body language, just to show that you are confident. So don't sit there with your arms crossed, but also don't stare at them in the eyes as well. Just make sure that you're open, friendly, and warm as well. And then thank them for their time at the end and ask any of the questions that you have. And then so after the interview is what we'll be going into next. So you've gone to the interview, you've decided it's a role that you'd really like to do. So the next steps would be confirm your interest with a follow-up email. So thank the interviewers for their time. Say that if you are interested in the role, obviously that you would love to be put forward for the next steps. Also, at the end of the interview, you can ask them what the next steps of the process are and maybe a rough time frame. And thank them for their time in an email after is always really nice. Also, have a think about references. So that would likely be the next step. So have a think about who you'd like and maybe start making some contact with them, preferably over the last couple of years. So not someone from a really long time ago, and someone that you have a good working relationship with that can advocate for your skills and someone you trust that will be able to give you a positive professional reference in the best light. And then you can always do a follow-up phone call or email if you haven't heard back, just to confirm, I suppose, next steps or when you will hear. But that's them my main tips for preparing for an interview. So to summarize, before the interview, it's really just doing your research, making sure you fully understand the role, the company, their values, and then understanding yourself. So revising your PD, you're not your PD, your CV, practicing as well with a friend, and then researching location and everything. And then during the interview, slowing down, deep breaths, arriving early, and then after the interview, follow up and references. But yeah, those are my main tips for preparing for an interview, and I hope this helps. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Christina. And last but certainly not least, and we will get to questions just after Leanne is going to talk to us about handling resignations and counter offers, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So thank you for some of those questions coming through, and we will get to them shortly.
Hi, I'm Leanne and I'm from the Brisbane office, and I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the resignation process and the potential for a counteroffer. Now, before we even start going into that, I would just like to say, when you're going in to resign, just sit back and think about what was your original reason for going into the market to explore that next opportunity, and sit down and figure out if it is something that can be changed, if it would be changed, and if you feel that change will be enough to keep you there. If the answer to these questions are all no, then prepare yourself for the resignation process. Now, in terms of the next step for the resignation, there's a couple of points you need to first look at before you go in and tender your resignation. First thing is to go in and check your employment contract if you haven't already checked that prior to applying to a role. Your notice could be 24 hours, a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or even more, depending on the level of the role and that or accountability you have in an organization. But it's critical to know what that notice period is, because that is part of what you're going to put into that resignation letter. Prepare your resignation letter, and I'll give you a few tips on this shortly. Request an in-person meeting with your manager. Don't do it via a pure email. Have the conversation, and from there, once you have verbally resigned from the organization, share the formal resignation letter with them. And the next step would be to confirm what your transition out of the business would look like in terms of timeframes, their requirements, what you're looking at. And at this stage is potentially where you could look to try and negotiate flexibility around that notice period. And at the same time, always thank them for their time, opportunity, and the support they've provided for you while in the business and in the role. Now, when it comes to resignations, a formal resignation letter is not just to formalize your departure from the organization. It is really more around focusing around that professional courtesy that helps you maintain your reputation and helps for a smoother transition out of one role into the next opportunity. I always say to candidates, exit gracefully. Irrespective of how you feel in that moment about the organization or a situation that may have arisen, um, never burn a bridge, because you never know when you'll need that bridge in the future again. And what I mean by that is, it could be that the new role that you go into may not work out and you may want to go back to the original organization. It could be that the people that you are resigning to move to a new organization where you applied to a role in, and you'd like them to be a positive advocate for you in that situation as well. So exit gracefully. If we start thinking about the resignation letter itself, there's a few things it's important for you to include in that letter. So the first thing would be to ensure that you put the date that you are resigning from at the top. Also ensure that you add your personal details so that that way they can see the date that you've resigned, your information as to who is resigning. Don't address your resignation letter to whom it may concern, which I know sometimes is easier because you're not quite sure who would be the right person that you would be to resign to. But your direct manager would be the person you would add on there. So it would be Dear Adam, Dear Jane, Dear Bob. Clearly state that you are resigning from the position in the organization and when your last day will be. An example of this would be, I hereby tender my resignation as administrator at ABC Shoes. My last effective day will be on the 18th of October. This is a clear indication of when you will be leaving. Your last day will be in that organization, and make sure it ties into your notice period. Clearly state if you can, briefly explain why you're leaving the organization or the role. Now, it doesn't have to be as detailed in the sense of, I will be joining XYZ Shoes in another role. It could just be a case of, I've received a job offer that I simply cannot refuse. It could be, I've received a job offer that will help develop my career further. There's a number of reasons why people are looking to move for a role, which is something that you can share up to the level of your comfort. Make sure that when you have your resignation letter at the bottom, you do thank the employer for the opportunity you've had to work in the organization, be part of the team, and offer assistance in terms of that transition for you to move out of the business. And what I mean by that is, offer to help train the next person coming into the role, offer to help put a training manual together to make it easier for the next person. In some instances, managers will appreciate the offer, but decline the offer. Some companies will be hesitant, depending on the situation around that resignation, that having the person that's moving out of the role take training the new person coming on board may be a positive, it may be a negative. So don't be offended if they decline the offer, but still make that offer. And always finish off by signing that resignation letter to make it official and that it's from you as well. Now, resigning from a role, generally speaking, for most people, it's not an easy process, especially when you've been with the business for a long period of time and you are a strong team member in that organization. but keep it as professional as possible. Keep it on point so that way it becomes a smooth process, but also your transition out of the business becomes just as smooth as well. Now, counteroffers have become a lot more prevalent in the last couple of years, and they've always been around. But for me, a counteroffer, there's pros and cons to it. But like I said when I first started talking, is you need to identify what your reason for leaving the organization was before you went to the market, and identifying whether or not those frustrations or challenges can be changed. Now, I've heard people say to me that they've gone in to resign from their manager and their manager refuses to accept their resignation. Legally, they can't do it. But when that conversation starts to arise, be mindful of the fact that there is potentially a counteroffer that is going to come your way. Now, when we start talking about counteroffers in the market at the moment, in the past, it used to be very much around the financial aspects of what can be offered to retain someone in their business. Now, with the current market at the moment, there are so many different things that can be offered. Increased salary, offer for flexibility. And like Ben said, that flexibility would be very dependent on what would be right for you and for the business. And it could be early start, early finish. It could be work from home 2 days a week. So see what that is that they offer you. It could be a promotion. It could be additional training. It could be a bonus. It could be more. But like I said, remember what drove you to explore the market in the first place when this counteroffer comes in. Now, if you are given a counteroffer, there's a few things you need to ask yourself when the counteroffer comes in. Do I still want to be in this role, in this organization for the long term? If you've had a conversation, which Ben mentioned as well, with your manager prior to going into the market and you'd expressed your frustrations or your concerns or your requirements, and there was no solution offered, what's changed? The another question to ask is, will my resignation change the dynamics of my internal relationships, especially if they weren't aware of the fact that you were frustrated to start off with? Will what they offer me satisfy me long time? Will they actually follow through on what's been offered? And if you have had all those conversations with your manager and nothing was done, then ask yourself, why now? If you identify the counteroffer they've given you is not ticking the boxes for you, or you are firm in your decision to make that move, graciously decline the counteroffer then and there. Tell them that you're moving on, you appreciate the offer, you've enjoyed yourself with the organization. If it's for growth and they're not able to offer you the growth that you're looking for, explain that to them. But rather do it then than leave it and have to come back. Now, if you decide that you are open to a counteroffer, and you haven't had that conversation with your manager and they weren't aware of the fact that you were looking, don't accept the counteroffer straight away. Find out what they are offering you, review it, analyze it, and figure out if it is going to tick the boxes for you long term. Now, I always say to candidates, if your company offers you $10,000 more today, that would be a great asset to you in the short term because it increases your take-home salary. However, we are human, and in 6 months' time, unless you really are shrewd at saving your money, chances are you'll be back at square one because your lifestyle may have changed. And with the way things are increasing in cost of living at the moment, it could absorb most of that anyway. But if it is not just about the money and they weren't aware of it, see what they can offer you. Ask them to put it in writing, so that way if you do decide to accept the counter offer and you stay, you've got confirmation that those changes will come through. If you decide not to accept, you've spoken to them, you reviewed, and at that stage you decide it's not the right offer for you, and you're still moving on, tell them up front. Be very careful of playing too many games when you have a offer on the table from a new organization that's seen the value in you from day one, offered you what you're looking for, playing them off against your current employer, because you could end up in a situation when you walk away with nothing, where the company that's offered you the position you've taken too long because you're going backwards and forwards decides to withdraw the offer because they need someone to start ASAP, and your current employer then decides, well, you haven't come back to us on the counter offer, we're going to accept your resignation. It's always very important to remember to keep your brand and your reputation intact and keep those relationships. Now, if you've decided to stay with the organization, that's great. Re-engage yourself back into the business and keep going. If you have made that decision to move out of the business, for me, it's key, and I say this to everyone, transition out of the business with style. And what I mean by that is, if you have 2 weeks' notice, work your 2 weeks' notice. If you've got leave already planned during that period and it was already approved, that's okay. But don't all of a sudden, where you've had a great track record of attendance, all of a sudden start taking time off or sitting back and not getting the job done. Continue delivering on the work that you need to do. You want to keep that reputation strong. You want people, when you've left that business, to go, Bob in his notice period worked really hard, still contributed to the business. I would have him back in a heartbeat, as opposed to Bob sat with his feet on the table, didn't get any work done, distracted everyone from the team. I'm quite glad he's gone. So those are the critical things that are important for you to consider when you are going through that resignation period. Keep it short, keep it professional, keep the relationships, make sure your brand and reputation is intact, and transition out of the business gracefully into that next opportunity. And that's all for me. Back to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Leanne. So we do have a couple of questions to go through. So I'll first of all go through the ones most recently. So thank you, Thomas. So he's asked, with the market as busy as it is at the moment, how difficult is it for a recent grad student to break into their desired industry? Well, at the moment, it shouldn't be particularly difficult. It does depend, obviously, what sector you're going into. In fact, I was just talking to someone earlier that was saying a very large mining company was looking to take on their grad intake of mining engineers and felt short, essentially. Couldn't actually find enough people in that area to hire. So it will depend, but I would answer the question by saying it shouldn't be too difficult. Your second question saying that is unfortunate to read that you recently graduated 2020 and then got laid off in your first role due to COVID. Should you leave it in your CV? I think you should. I think that I would definitely include it if you were there for, say, 4 months. I would make a mention of the reason that you're no longer there. I would address that, something along the lines of, redundancy due to COVID in brackets, just so it answers the question. I think with anything on a CV where there may be a particular short period of time and we don't know why, I would just address it so someone can look at it and go, oh, that's why. They don't need to spend their time guessing, because people generally guess to the negative. Next, we've got a question from Nay, and this actually be one for you, Christina. So Nay's asked, do you think interviews will move back to being more face-to-face? And do you think I'd have less of a chance at the job in question if I was to prefer online interviews?
I think it's really dependent. It can be both, really. So, from what I've experienced, there are some clients who are doing interviews via Teams, and that's just, if they have an urgent need to have a process moving really quickly, it's just easier to coordinate a Teams interview in the time frame. Or if it is face-to-face, we have some, interviewers who do prefer to do a face-to-face interview, which I think is really good, because you get to get a feel for the office, get a feel for the culture. So it is likely, though, if it is a permanent opportunity, that there will be a face-to-face interview. But it is really a bit of a combination at the moment. A bit of both, really.
Yeah, and I think there are some organisations, of course, that really only want to do face-to-face. So in that case, yes, it would harm your chances. But generally, we are seeing that, particularly for first-round interviews, people are quite happy to do a say, Teams interview or video interview to begin with. And then one for Leanne. So this is from Isabel. Got sent an offer for a similar job that I currently have that is almost double the salary, but I think there might be more opportunity for growth and progression in my current job, but they are unwilling to consider a pay rise. How should I handle this?
Isabel, it's a challenge for someone else to make the decision for you. I think the key thing for you would be to identify what your driving factor is from that long-term career, whether it be the growth and progression, or whether it be the salary and not necessarily being given that opportunity for that growth that you're by the sounds of things looking for. I would definitely approach your one-up and have that conversation. If you find you're not necessarily getting much response from that person, potentially have a chat to HR to find out what the best steps would be. Most organizations in some instances have what they call a one-up policy, where if you're not getting the response from your direct manager, you're able to go to the one-up, depending on, as I say, depending on a company. But I would have those conversations and then have a look at your circumstances and figure out what's important for you, whether it's the double the salary or it's the long-term growth and development in an organization.
Great, thanks, Leanne. And I've got a question from Judy. Do you have any tips on securing a role for a mature person who hasn't worked in 15 years? Well, actually, we just had somebody that's got interviewed this morning. It hadn't worked for 4 years. The tips that I would give would say make sure that you're able to, 15 years is quite a long time, particularly around sort of a lot of things have changed around maybe even video interviews. So this person we're working with wasn't familiar with the likes of Teams or Zoom. So they actually spent quite a bit of time in learning how it works, making sure they had a laptop to enable them to be able to have a video interview to begin with. And I think I would make a mention as best you can on anything that you can do to upskill yourself just to keep it relevant. So I think technology is probably the biggest thing if you haven't maybe been in an environment in the corporate sector for 15 years to really focus on. And the second question that we have from Sam, do you have any advice for recent university graduates applying for non-graduate entry-level positions? I would say to that one, if you're a recent graduate and you're just applying to a general role, typically what we would see as a challenge is the lack of obviously actual experience to put on the CV. So that does happen for us, and we generally find that unless someone's got a year or two experience, it is quite difficult to break into it. But being very candid at short, if you can demonstrate that through your course, being a graduate, that you had some experience, and it might be a particular piece of coursework that might be able to utilize your skills, it's going to be relevant to the job, that is definitely the best way to go about it. Also, if obviously you're working during your study, that's very handy as well. And we've got one here come through from Rena. Do you have any advice for myself as changing career from childcare services to accounting? As they are asking in the interview, why would you like to take on an account role? Just want to check it is accounting. So I think making the, here we go. You also give a few sentences to speak on how the freshers can speak when they ask what experience you have. Right. That's what you mean. So making a move from childcare, why are you looking to get into accounting? Well, I think the obvious answer to that is that obviously there is a reason for yourself. I would make sure that you try and keep it as succinct and sort of when someone asks you that question, you're able just to relay it. So have a real think about it. At a guess, I'd imagine there must be a passion that you have for making that switch to an accounting position, and just think about what the drivers are. It'd be all too easy to maybe not got that exactly right. So do some role play, almost if you're just sitting in your room thinking, right, when I get this question, what am I going to say? Because if you just go into it, it might not come out exactly as you like. And got time just for a few more, if there's any more coming through. And I think from Ruka, can we work full-time while doing studies, and should we apply for roles as international students? Can you work full-time while doing studies? That might be a visa question. I know that it has changed most recently, and there's been a relaxation around the limit to the number of hours that you can do if you are on a visa as an international student. Just make sure when you are applying to roles that you do the research on that. I think if you're applying to position, read up on the visa, know exactly what type of visa you're on, and put it in your CV to say, I'm currently on this visa and these are the work restrictions, because it makes it easier for everybody looking at it. And last one from Sam, do you recommend connecting with a recruiter when looking for positions as a graduate? I would say, Sam, that it is that there are certain recruiters that get involved in graduate recruitment, but to be honest, it's predominantly done graduate intakes by the employer themselves. We typically work with people that have at least 1 to 2 years experience, because when an employer comes to us, they also look for saying we want these skills, whereas I would say most of the graduate recruitment actually happens direct. So I would suggest having a look at the companies that run graduate recruitment programs. And that is pretty much it. I think if there's any others that are still coming through, we will make sure we'll get back to you. And thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to Christina. Thank you to Georgia. And thank you to Leanne.